Okay, we'll be looking on the layout of the sugar plantation as existed in the 18th to 19th century. But before we look at the layout of the plantation, what is a plantation? Oh, I didn't know. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to EJC Online Classroom. We will be looking on history this afternoon, in particularly the layout of the sugar plantation in the 18th to 19th century. I am Arzella Miller, a teacher at Kingsway High School. But before we get into the lesson, we will have prayer. Let us pray. Almighty God and our Father, thank you for being the wonderful teacher that you are, the master teacher. We thank you for our history. Because of history, we can go back in time to know about your words. And as I teach this lesson this afternoon to your children, wherever they are, I hope that this will be an effective lesson and it will go to further their cause. Father, please touch my brain cells and open up my understanding as I impart this lesson to them. In Jesus' name I pray. So, what is a plantation? A plantation is about 50 to 2,000 hectares of land, flat, fertile lands, right? And so, in the 18th to 19th century, we know that for most of the land in Jamaica and other Caribbean islands, they were under sugar. We had several plantations in our Caribbean islands. And so we are going to look on a typical sugar plantation in Jamaica in the 18th to 19th century. First of all, we have what we call the layout of the plantation. And on screen, you have the layout with several different buildings, right? Several different buildings and other sections of the estate and other sections of the estate that had the orchard, the cash crops, and the sugar. But most of the estate was under sugar. Now we have several different buildings on the estate also. We had what you call the mill, and then there were 3 types of mills. You have the windmill, then you have the water mill that were operated by water, and that is why the sugar estate was always beside a river, a stream, or the sea, to use this to power the engine. And then you'll have animal-drawn mills that were used to operate the mills. Now, after the mill, you have what is called the chash house. When the cane, the sugar cane, was transported to the mill to be extracted, the juice to be extracted, the chash from the cane would be sent to the chash house to be stored. Not only to be stored, but in the future to be used as fuel. Fuel to boil the sugar juice or to make bagasse board. After the chash house, you have what is called the curing house. After the chash house, you have what is called the boiling house, where the juice from the sugar cane would be boiled to be remove impurities and so forth. After the sugar juice was boiled, it was sent to the cooling trough where the sugar would be cooled. Before cooling, the wet sugar was placed in what we call hogsheads. Now, hogsheads were wooden barrels to store the wet sugar. And then after placed in the hogsheads, the last place that the sugar would be sent to, the wet sugar, would be the curing house. And the wet sugar would be stored in the hogsheads in the curing house for at least 4 weeks, when the excess molasses, excess wet sugar that is called molasses, would be dripped out of the hogsheads. And this molasses would be sent to the distillery along with the skimmings that came from the sugar juice to be distilled and to help to make rum for export. Now we have here examples of what we call hogsheads, where the wet juice, wet sugar was placed into these. This is what we call the hogsheads. These are examples of the hogsheads that the wet sugar was placed into. Right? So on the plantation, we also have the slave huts. These are examples of the slave huts where the slaves lived in these huts. They were built one room, only one room with one window and one door, and the top would be made out of trash. In comparison to the great house where the planters lived, these buildings were elaborate and very fine and made out of sturdy structure in comparison to the lowly building of the slaves. So we see there the great house. So on the estate, there were seasons, 2 particular seasons. One was called the dead season. And the dead season was between August and November. Now, during this time, nothing much was happening on the estate. It was kind of quiet on the estate, August to November. At that time, the slave had little to do. Sometimes the masters would even send them out to work on different estates. Now, in the dead season, the slaves would be doing what you call hoeing. Hoeing now is when they were digging the holes to plant the canes, right? And they would be also manuring ratoons, right? What are ratoons? Ratoons are the stubs of cane that were like cut the year before, but the stub remained in the ground and they sprout up. And these ratoons could be used over like for a 2-year span, where the planter did not have to dig up the land again to plant fresh cane, but they would nurture, manure the stubs that were left in the ground. That is what is called ratoons. And so the slaves would be manuring those and weeding them. during the dead season. They would also construct buildings and cutting timbers and making roads and doing other odd jobs until the crop was ready. Now, the crop season was between November and July, the busiest and the most important period on the plantation calendar. It was 24/7, right around the clock. The slaves would be working. The slaves would begin with cane cutting and continuing with the manufacturing of sugar. And as I've said before, that the manufacturing of sugar starts from in the field where the cane has been planted, reaping, manuring and reaping, and when it was time for harvesting until it reaches the mill. And from the mill, when the process would begin. Now, the sugar making process, it is not as we look on it, but it has several different ways how the sugar is processed. I have there a diagram. And diagram number 1, the sugar making process, you have the mill first, then you have the chash house. So the juice is being extracted in the mill, at the mill house, and then the chash would go to the chash house. And as you can see on the diagram, from the mill to the chash house, then to the boiling house. And so the chash would go to the boiling house to boil the juice. And from the boiling house, it would go to the cooling trough, right? And from the cooling trough, then it would go down to the curing house. From then on, it would go to the still house. And from the still house, it would now be ready to go to the wharf. So, how does the sugar making process continues? Right? The juice is put into a cooling trough. The manufacturing process was a time-consuming one. It would begin with the cane being sent to the mill to be crushed and the juice extracted, then the chash sent to the chash house. The cane juice was sent to the boiling house where it passed through a series of boilers. Then it was taken from the cistern, strained, and put into the first copper kettle, which was the largest, because we had several of those copper kettles, right? The juice was then skimmed to remove the impurities, and then it would be channeled through the other kettles, each smaller and hotter than the previous one. The last kettle, called the teach, was where the sugar became thick syrup. So the sugar juice would be boiled, and boiled down until when you test it, it would become like thick syrup. It is then put into the cooling trough, so it is being cooled now, where the sugar crystals hardened around a sticky core of molasses. The raw sugar was then shoveled from the cooling trough into the hogsheads, wooden barrels. And previously, I did show you what hogsheads look like, where they were put in the curing house. So the hogsheads were placed into the curing house. In the curing house, the molasses was drained through holes in the bottom of the hogsheads. So holes would be bored in the bottom of the hogsheads for the extra juice, liquid, to be dripped out. And this raw sugar, when it was wet, was also called muscadava sugar. After 4 weeks, the holes were plugged, ready for export to England, where the final processing would take place. And there were 3 special wharves in England where these wharves work with the Caribbean. Bristol was one of them. And as we go on, we will discover the next 2 wharves that the processing would take place. Now, on the plantation, we have what we call a social stratification. Social stratification. This pyramid will show you how the plantation hierarchy was set out. At the very top of the plantation pyramid, you have the whites. They were in control. They were the big planters. Some of them lived in the Caribbean, some lived abroad. And then they were also called absentee owners. They lived abroad and operated from abroad. So the white planters, they formed the plantocracy. They were also overseers, right? So those absentee owners who lived abroad, they employed persons who we called overseers to oversee their business while they lived abroad. Next, on the pyramid, we have colored. The colored people, these were like a white father and a black mother. And so these persons, we call them colored. They were neither black nor white. So we call them coloreds, right? And then alongside the coloreds, we would have free blacks. They aspired towards the values of the white. So the whites at the top of the pyramid, the coloreds want to get up there. The blacks, the free blacks, want to get up there. You notice I said free blacks. They wanted to get up to the top of the pinnacle also, right? The free blacks and the coloreds, they have professions. They were lawyers, they were shopkeepers, and so on. Then, down at the bottom of the pyramid, you have the blacks, the enslaved. They were not in a position. Some of them were not even skillful. All they could do was to work in the fields. So they were at the bottom of the ladder. So, the planter, he lived in the great house. And as the name suggests, and as you have seen previously, the great house, the big, elaborate, stone cutting, and fancy looking great house, there the planters lived in great luxury and splendor. They ate the best food, they wore the best clothing, and so they lived in this great luxury that every slave or colored person would envy. The house was perched on the top of a hill. Most times. And this was a special reason why the great house was on top of a hill. The great house was on top of the hill because of surveillance. Up there, the planter could stay right up there with his binoculars, and he would look over his plantation. And there and then, he could detect if slaves were planning to run away or they were planning anything untoward, like planning a revolt or doing something, because in order to rebel against slavery, the slaves would maim the animals, they would destroy the carts, they would do anything to rebel against slavery. So oftentimes the planters would stay right up on top of the hill there and looking over, surveying their plantations. Secondly, down in the flat where the estate were, the noise from the factory yard, the slaves cutting and rebelling and arguing and all of these things. The planters did not want to have anything to do with those things. And so to easily get away, their house was far away from the rest of the working people, and especially the slaves, because the slaves live in a very deplorable condition. Very deplorable condition. Their houses were very close, and if they rear animals, they were so close to them that the stench from the animals and the unhygienic condition of the slaves would turn off the planters, and so they would want to be far away from them. And as a matter of fact, the planters did not see the slaves as humans. They see them as animals, things, right? They didn't want to get close to them. So below the planter's house, you have the overseers, right? These were persons who oversee the estate. The planter did not have to go on the plantation because you have what persons who you call overseers. They were estate managers. They made decisions about crops, about sugar manufacturing, and labor, right? They were the ones who called the shots outside of the planters. Then you have the clerks and the bookkeepers. These include the stock clerks and the slave supervisors. Now, these clerks and bookkeepers, they have to have a record of all the slaves who were on the plantation. They would have to have records of how many pieces of clothing were issued to slaves. They have to have precisely a record of everything to show that the plantation was really being managed in the right way. Then you have the blacks. Were divided into 3 groups, right? You have the domestic or the house slaves, the artisan or the skilled slaves, and then the fee slaves who were further divided into 3 gangs. Let me move over to my board over here. All right, so up here, you had the planters and all the overseers, right? So coming down, you'll have the colored, right? Free blacks, right? Now we are coming down to the slaves. So if you should take off here All these would have been slaves. So you have the domestic slaves, otherwise called the house slaves, because they work only in the house. They work only in the house, right? And these domestic slaves would often see themselves higher than the skilled slave. Reason, because they were always in touch with the planters. As domestic slaves sometimes would even learn to read, because they were among papers, they were hearing news, they were the ones who caused most of the rebellions, because sometimes they hear something and they did not hear exactly what the planter might be discussing with his wife, and so they carry out a half-truth story, and the other slaves would now plan a rebellion depending on what the domestic slaves took out of the house. The planters were also wary of the house slaves. They were the ones that would put poison in their meals, right? These are the slaves who would steal from the planters, right? And so they were always wary of the house slaves. Now you have the skilled slaves. These slaves were also called artisans, right? Art, as the word suggests, because they were skilled in making things. Some of them were carpenters. They were blacksmiths. They were the ones who would make the hogsheads to put the wet sugar in for curing and then for export. Then you have down here the largest section of slaves. The largest section of slaves, they were unskilled. Right? They were unskilled. They were mainly on the plantation, cutting, weeding, and manuring the canes. Right? So these slaves, unskilled slaves, right, could further be placed into three groups. You have the first gang, then you have the second gang, and the third gangs, right? So the slaves here, the unskilled slaves, could further be divided into three groups. 1, 2, 3. Now, the first set of slaves, they were the strongest. The strongest set of slaves. They would dig the holes to plant the canes. They would cut and clear the woodland, right? Because on the plantation, you have a separate section that was called a woodland area, right? And this woodland area was secured to grow lumber to make furniture, as well as to make other things on the plantation, as well as for fuel. So the strongest of the slaves would be in the first gang. They would do the hardest part of the work on the plantation, digging holes, cutting down large forested areas, and all of those things that were the hardest job on the plantation. And these were men ranging from 35 to maybe 25, right? They were the strongest. Then in the middle here, you have the second gang. And the second gang here would be boys and girls, 25 downwards to maybe 15 or so. They would clear the areas. They would feed the animals on the plantation. They also would be the ones to clear the areas clear other areas for planting other crops that were lighter than what the slaves in the first gang would have done. Now, in the third gang, which is called the picnic are the old people gang, right? So here you have children from like 14 going down, and no matter how small the child was on a plantation, they would have to work. So in the picnic gang, they would carry water for the slaves. They would carry water, they would pick up trash, they would stay with the babies, along with the old persons that they call Nana. They would stay with the babies while the ladies that are breastfeeding, they are still working. And so they would be the ones, the picnic gang and the old people gang, they could not work. The older one that could not work anymore, they would be in this gang. So we see here where the unskilled slaves were further broken down into 3 other gangs called the first gang, the second gang, and the third gang. So, as we do an overview, we see where we have the cane fields. They take up most of the land area on the estate. We have the pasture for livestock. We have the quarters for the overseers and the bookkeepers. We have the great house that were far distant away from everyone else. And then we have an area where they would plant cash crops. And the slaves, these crops were also to feed the slaves. They helped to feed themselves on the estate. So we see the various buildings, we see the layout, we see the streams, because some of the mills were operated by water turbines, right? So the mills, it was necessary for these mills to be near the streams. And we see where the estates were also near seas, where for export, it would not be very hard for when the ships came in for the products, that they were easily sent to the wharf. Now you have here an assignment. You have an assignment here where you are asked to identify some buildings that are on the estate. You are asked to identify various buildings that are on the estate, and you are asked to state the difference between these buildings. Yes, I want to see the buildings, the assignment. Okay? So this is your assignment. Identify the areas labeled A to F. A to F on your identify the areas labeled A to F in the diagram below. And this values 9 marks. So students, based on the marks, you will know that this assignment should be at least 3 well-developed paragraphs. B, you are to explain the difference in location, size, and function of the types of housing shown in the diagram, 12 marks. So based on the marks, the mark scheme, you'll know that this will also asking of you to give me at least 4 well-developed paragraphs. C, other than buildings, list 4 uses of land on a typical 18th century plantation. And that's 4 marks. So you would have realized that you are asked to list. So you're just you will just be going straight ahead to list 1, 2, 3, 4, because that's just 4 marks. And so we have come to the end of our lesson. I do hope that you have learned something about the layout of an 18th century sugar plantation as existed in the Caribbean, to be specific, Jamaica.